Understanding Federal Flood Insurance in the Wake of Hurricane Harvey by Livy Rucka. Houston, Texas was hit by Hurricane Harvey in August of this year. The Category 4 hurricane beat the U.S. record for rainfall from a single storm and resulted in $75 billion in total losses. Over 30,000 people lost their homes. According to ProPublica and the Texas Tribune, the unprecedented damage was caused in large part by urban sprawl and paving the sponge. Houston has experienced extreme population growth in recent decades, which has caused heavy development and pavement over natural prairie that absorbs rainwater. Houston's Katy Prairie plays this crucial role. This GIF shows Houston's population growth starting in 1990, then 2000, and finally 2010. The sprawl is substantial between these decades. Now, flood insurance. According to NPR, flood insurance is necessary for people living in high-risk areas. But private insurance companies are wary of selling flood insurance because it is risky, and the risk is geographically correlated. Geographically correlated risk means that when a natural disaster strikes, like a flood or a hurricane, everyone in the area will have a massive claim. So, the federal government is responsible for insuring homes with a high risk of flooding. The National Flood Insurance Program is over $30 billion in debt to the U.S. Treasury because only 1% of homes in high-risk areas are responsible for 1/4 of the claims. Now, the NFIP cannot legally drop these homes. The federal government collects premiums and gives payouts, but there are some problems. Not enough people voluntarily purchase flood insurance, and people are not required to when their mortgage is paid off. People pay cheap premiums until a bad flood year, and the money pool does not add up to cover everyone. So, the NFIP continues borrowing money until in debt to the U.S. Treasury. That leaves taxpayers on the hook. Rates are supposed to reflect risk, and in this case, they do not. Some research questions regarding GIS and mapping are: how can GIS be used to map vulnerability in the wake of Hurricane Harvey in Houston? How can GIS be used to map FEMA floodplains in relation to where Houston actually flooded? Is there a correlation between flooding and vulnerability? And finally, how can federal flood insurance policies change so rate more accurately reflects risk? First, it is important to have a vulnerability map that conveys Houston's most vulnerable people because they will be most affected by the flooding. The vulnerability model includes an environmental justice layer that uses the feature to raster GIS tool to display low-income percent, less high school percent, and minority percent. From there, the raster calculator tool is used to create a vulnerability layer. This map shows that Houston's most vulnerable are largely populated in the middle of a city, with a few exceptions. This is important because this is where the floodplains are. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, created flood hazard maps that show 100-year floodplains, which means there is a 1% risk of flooding any given year. Homeowners residing in 100-year floodplains are required to have federal flood insurance. 500-year floodplains have a 0.2% risk of flooding any given year. However, according to the New York Times, Harvey caused homes to flood even though far from the FEMA zones. This 2010 FEMA floodplains map conveys areas with a 1% chance of flooding annually. And this map conveys where the water actually was. So, what went wrong with the FEMA maps? Well, FEMA maps are based on historical flood data, which means that the future impacts of climate change and development are not taken into account. Due to climate change, there will be more extreme weather in the future. FEMA also does not have flood maps for the entire U.S., leaving future homebuyers unaware of potential risks. So, how can FEMA floodplain maps be fixed? First, it is important to map proximity to water because the people nearest to water are the ones most at risk. The water features layer is the model builder input, and the Euclidean distance tool is used to create the output, distance from water. This map conveys proximity to water, yellow being near and pink far. Blue conveys Houston's water features. A second model uses the elevation input and the focal statistics tool to create the neighborhood elevation output, as well as the elevation input and the raster calculator tool to create the relative elevation and near water and low elevation outputs. This map conveys neighborhood elevation, white being high, relatively safe from flooding, and black low, dangerous. Relating back to the vulnerability map at the beginning, Houston's most vulnerable reside in low-lying areas in the middle of the city. This map conveys the final product, near water and low elevation. These are the most dangerous areas in Houston in terms of flooding. Blue represents near water and low elevation. The light blue represents Houston's water features. Once again, Houston's most vulnerable people reside in these areas. Now, onto some possible flood insurance solutions. Mandate flood insurance to spread risk and increase the pool of money so everyone can be covered. High-risk areas should pay high premiums, and low-risk areas should pay low premiums. According to NPR, a possible solution is NFIP Direct, which would require premiums to be raised until closer to what the homeowner should be paying based on the value of the home and property. But this policy would make it difficult for poor people to remain in their homes and neighborhoods, which is something to be taken into account. Other policy solutions, according to the International Journal of River Basin Management, should involve local government low-impact development policies that reduce the effects of urban sprawl. Natural prairie conservation falls into this category, like Houston's Katy Prairie, that naturally absorbs rainwater. According to the Taylor and Francis Online Journal of Risk Research, there should be solutions surrounding vulnerability and equality. Vulnerable people should have more mobility in terms of where they reside in relation to floodplains. Prevention of the most vulnerable from being confined to the worst flood zones before disaster strikes is crucial. A bit more about prevention. According to SSRN, long-term as opposed to short-term and temporary solutions is necessary. Cities like Houston need private and public collaboration to create prevention and mitigation strategies. For example, vouchers could be connected to loans for the most vulnerable people before a flood or hurricane hits. Thank you for listening.